A phrase comes to mind to describe this situation with the US bishops now suing the American administration over financial funding for the migration issue. A phrase comes to mind, and it's a phrase that comes to mind when you step back and look at the long sordid history of the US government with the US bishops. And it's the bishops' behavior, those with odd connections to US politicians who were those same bishops who were then later exposed as having had done some pretty evil things to young altar servers and seminarians and things. That phrase is, "You have sowed the wind and have reaped the whirlwind." They have done this to themselves. We have all heard homilies in ordinary foreign parishes where the priest tries to find a nice way to let you know that you're not giving enough money and that you need to give more. Oh, by the way, here's that second collection for Catholic Relief Services or Catholic Charities or the Rice Bowl or whatever it is. And you have heard, as years go on, this money talk from priests and bishops becoming more and more out in the open. We have seen women religious organizations, and as well as men's religious, but seemingly women's religious organizations in particular, getting crushed by local bishops, their property seized, and then sold off. Some of this obviously has to do with the lawsuits that came from those wicked priests doing wicked things to altar boys and seminarians, but also to make up for the lagging money being given from the laity, because the laity are simply not giving anymore. They have reaped the whirlwind. And now they're all worked up in a lather. Why? Because some estimates go, if Liz Yore in her talk recently about the US government's role in Benedict XVI's abdication from the papacy, if she's right, then 80% of the revenue of the church comes from governments. And in the United States, it's the US government to the bishops, up to 80%. And now that money is going to disappear largely. The bishops tell us they only get a certain amount of money from the federal government to cover the work they do with migrants. And strictly speaking, that's true. But remember, money is fungible. You can have money and give it to an organization and say, use it specifically for this thing. And if you do, they'll probably say, okay, but then it frees up money from that might otherwise be used for that purpose and moves it to somewhere else. It can be used for all sorts of things. And organizations, nonprofit organizations, famously contract with each other, or they award grants from one organization to another. And so money builds, and it can come from all sorts of places. And oftentimes that money originates from the government. 80% of their money comes from government, from the looks of it. I hope that Miss Yore is wrong. I don't think that she is. These bishops have allowed their love of money to darken their intellect. Sin darkens the intellect. Caesar came calling, jingling his bag of dirty silver, and asked them to render unto Caesar what belonged to God. And in this case, what belonged to God were the instruments of the Catholic Church. He asked them this of them for the helping of his program. And he did so in a most seductive way. We have mutual interests, Caesar said over the decades, especially after the end of the Cold War. We have mutual interests to help the poor, the sick, the needy. This is your church's, one of your the missions of your church. Well, it is also something that our government has taken upon itself to alleviate within the national interests of the United States and to help the poor in other countries as a means of diplomacy and goodwill and helping to prevent extremism and all sorts of other things. How about we work together? Because there's so much overlap in our mutual interests that we can accomplish our missions better together. That was what he did. What's what Uncle Sam did. And yes, a lot of good people were helped who desperately needed the help. But the church has consistently said the ends do not justify the means. If Uncle Sam's intentions had been pure, it probably would not be a problem. After all, there's nothing wrong with a nonprofit organization going and helping poor people wherever they are. In fact, that's what a Catholic nonprofit should be doing. But that the intentions were not pure. And it is now to the point where the US bishops will say, even the better ones, the ones who take a more moderate approach to this issue, will say that it is the duty of the church to help facilitate the new arrivals in making a new life here, and that the laws need to be changed to facilitate that. Meanwhile, the public is growing incredibly weary of this, to the point where now even the legal form of the new arrivals is objected to by increasing numbers of people. And the large scale removal of such people gets high marks of praise from the American public across ideological lines. The bishops could feel emboldened by this. After all, the gospel is actually unpopular. When you actually think about what it requires of you as a Catholic or as a Christian more broadly, the gospel is actually unpopular. It makes demands of you that puts you at odds with the world. And so it would be very easy in this case to say for the bishops that they stand against the world to do the will of God. The most seductive lie you will ever tell yourself is the lie you tell yourself. The most seductive lie is not something the devil necessarily tells you. It is the lie you convince yourself. Priests sometimes repeat these lies themselves in the confessional, infamously with the private sin, as Pope Pius XII called it, those violations of the sixth and ninth commandment, where what you do is a habit, and as a habit, the church says it's not the culpability is lessened as long as you're actively trying to resist it. And to a degree, that might be true, but there is still that caveat of trying to resist it. And then we will begin to tell ourselves the lie. Well, resisting it, yes, but not as much as maybe should be, etc., and thereby enabling your own bad behavior. The great lie these bishops are telling themselves is that it's okay to accept Caesar's dirty silver coins to help subvert the culture, to help destabilize things, to help rob countries of their greatest treasure of all, which is their own future generations, their own people, to bring them for some political experiment in a land that doesn't even want them there, but whose government and whose wealthy rulers certainly do. That it's okay to take Caesar's dirty money for that purpose. And after all, by doing so, they're doing the will of God. These bishops place the United States government on the side of the angels and their own Catholics who seem to object to this to varying degrees, as well as the people of the country as the great villains in this story. The most seductive lie you tell yourself is the one that you tell yourself. The most seductive lie you'll ever hear is the one that you tell to yourself. And what will happen if you stay on the path of lying to yourself about your favorite pet sin? You'll sow the wind and you will reap the whirlwind. That is what these bishops have done. That is what they're now experiencing. There are many Catholics who reach out to me, and I see this in discourse on social media, and I see this Catholics just talking to each other, that they will no longer give money to their parishes because they know their parish will impose a tax on the parish, take a small percentage of the collected tithe from the parish to give to the diocese. The bishops are already talking openly about trying to make up the shortfall from the government to keep these programs going. Many Catholics will say that their tithes will instead go to direct funding of seminarians, directly funding food box programs for the poor, or whatever else other nonprofit organizations they have come to trust that are actually doing the work that Christ compels us to do as Catholics. But what they won't do is give to their shepherds, because they've discovered their shepherds, even some of the better ones who say the right things about the Latin Mass and Catholic morality, are often wolves in shepherd's clothing. Or if not so much wolves in shepherd's clothing, have at least lost their way. The bishops had better be ready for this to get worse for them, because there is no other option that many Catholics feel they have, but to say no more. That is where we are. It is a dark future for the church in America, especially if investigations are launched by the government into the influence certain organs of government had on the church and what the church used money for. The U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops had better pray that they are never investigated by the government for what it used money for. There is a downside to these lawsuits, by the way. Most people don't ever think about this. The USCCB has filed lawsuit against the US government. And when filing lawsuits, there is a process called discovery. You have to give relevant records, relevant communications to the other side in a court proceeding. It's required by law. The US bishops, having filed suit against the US government, now open themselves up to the discovery process. That seems incredibly poorly thought out to me. They will reap the whirlwind. Let me know what you thought of this in the comments, please. So like and subscribe if you haven't. It certainly helps. So to sharing this on social media, that helps too. And as always, pray for the church. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.